Welcome to Coaching Culture, the podcast about cultivating culture and leadership. I'm Ben Herring, and I've been loving this side of the game for bloody ages. Today's guest is Ben Darwin. Ben is back. The guy behind Gainline Analytics, who we love on the show because he provides the data that defines cohesion. And I reckon it's some of the world's very best stats. Third time on the show, and my message board absolutely lights up after every session we have done with him on the podcast. Today we're going to dive deep into some stats around making good coaches and picking good coaches and why changing coaches has all sorts of stuff associated with that. Ben Darwin, welcome back to the Coaching Culture podcast.
Hello, Ben, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. What a pleasure. We're going to rip in to some stuff which is going to light people up today, I reckon, Benny, about some of the stats you've got on changing coaches. It is a topical thing. What have you seen in your work about when clubs decide they're going to change coaches? And what are some of the stats say on this stuff? And what's your insight and experience with your analytics company?
This begins in many ways almost anecdotally, which is our experience of having these conversations with clubs. The interesting thing to me a lot of the time is we'll come to a club and they're in some sort of crisis. If they're going well, 30% of the time they'll come to us and things are going great. And most of the time they come to us and things are going poorly and they want to understand why. But it's really hard for them to change their thinking on whether they like a coach or don't like a coach as the current. But the really interesting thing seems to be is that they're not, it's almost like they're more obsessed about the bloke they could have. So there's someone out there who's doing, let's say Ben Herring's at the Auckland Blues and he's just won a title. And for some reason he's off contract. And you're at Super Rugby Club here in Australia A. If they haven't had the year they want, there's just this absolute theoretical magic around you. And all of the focus basically is on how do we get this guy and how are we going to justify getting rid of the other bloke, the guy we currently have. And so you see this internationally, you see this with clubs, that they've already started talking to the next person. They've already in that conversation. They don't know any of that person's weaknesses. They know all of the weaknesses of the guy they have. And it's almost like a fait accompli. And so when the review is done, it's done in that guise. If they really want that person to go, they'll ask the players, or sometimes they won't ask the players. Right? If it comes down to, it comes down to wins, it's, this is a results business. We have to have success. And unfortunately, that's the nature of it. We're very happy. We wish this guy all the best, and these guys had exited. Obviously, from our perspective, so much of the time that coach isn't necessarily underperforming at all. And the state of the club is the issue, particularly with some clubs, or countries for that matter. But that's a really difficult long-term solve, and that's not palatable a lot of the time. It's not the conversation we want to have. We want to have a conversation about this person that can kind of fix it. And we sort of call this the yes, but conversation. Yes, we want to fix it, but if this guy's available, and if he's not available, I've literally had this conversation, if this guy's not going to be available at other times, then we've really got to probably pick him up because there's not a great opportunity to bring this guy in. And then invariably that person is brought in and then they find that person cannot perform to the same standard they had in the last organization. And the same problems are the same problems that were previously there. And what you buy is not what you get. We know that from a player's perspective. We know that from a coach's perspective. And so then we end up having the same conversation, except this time half the board gets removed for the last decision. And so now you're having the same conversation with new people who weren't there at the last conversation and need to be reconnected to the same levels of understanding. So you get these kind of merry-go-rounds. We've had one conversation where we presented to a board and they said, "This is great. You should have been here." And we said, "We were, but none of you were here." Right? You were in the room 4 years ago. We just signed on with another club we spoke to, we did some work with 10 years ago, right? And it was like, we have to actually work on this problem. Let's stop trying to fix the problem through, acquisition of talent. So I went and decided to look at rugby league. Now, over the past 1998, so what's that, 7 years? The most successful team in 27, 28 years in the NRL has been the Melbourne Storm. And there's a really long line of assistant coaches coming from the Melbourne Storm or former head coaches, but mainly obviously because Bellamy's done so the state for so long, then going to other clubs. And so I wanted to look at how those guys did if they left the Storm and they ended up somewhere else, and how the club did in those years. And then when I finished that, I was like, oh, let's do the other end of the scale. So we went and did the West Tigers. And the West Tigers is the opposite of that because they have the worst record in the last, they've been around since 2000. So understanding to a little bit less games involved here, about 40 games less, but fundamentally pretty close. So with the Storm, there's been 15 coaches that we qualified as ex-head coaches and of course, Melbourne Storm just weren't successful during goal. I mean, they won the comp in their second year, right? So they've had that level of success. There's 15 guys who are assistant coaches or head coaches who've gone on and coached at other places. They've won 45.79% of their games. 45.79 sounds pretty close to 50%, but it's important to understand that everyone basically sits between 70% and 35%. You don't get clubs that only win 20% of their games total. Like everyone's really about that middle line. So 45% winning record, 45.79% winning record is not good. So that's Storm assistant coaches if they go somewhere else. And in terms of those seasons, there's 79 seasons and only 32 of them are 50% better, 50% or better. So they have a 40.51% positive win record. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
West Tigers, and the interesting thing is, first of all, is there's not many people who come from West Tigers who go anywhere else, obviously because of their lack of success. So coaching careers don't go to die at the Melbourne Storm. They go to die when you go somewhere else. So you work at this club. It's interesting, for example, Aaron Bellamy is probably never going to leave his dad's side. That would be very smart not to do that, right? Because you're just going to stay at the Storm. But everyone else like, okay, this is a stepping stone. And this is not, there's guys who've had success, but it's hard, right? There's a lot of guys who hasn't gone further, or maybe they've gone one or two clubs and it's ended, or they've gone being a head coach, then back to an assistant coach. But fundamentally, your career does not die at the Storm. You'll get picked up somewhere else, right? It's like being under Belichick when the Patriots were there. And then the guys who've left the Patriots in the same way who are assistants who've gone elsewhere also haven't been successful, nor has Belichick actually, for that matter. But with the West Tigers, very, very few of them ever get picked up. So there's only 6 of them, right? And so it's guys who were assistant coaches who then go somewhere else and end up being a head coach. But generally they have to go somewhere else, then have success, then get picked up. Does that make sense? As a head coach. But they, on average, in 56.69% of their games, and 60% of their seasons are positive. So I'm not saying, cause and effect is really interesting, and we'll have our notions about it. But fundamentally, the history of guys who've left West Tigers as coaches do better on average than guys who've left the Melbourne Storm as coaches by a huge margin.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, huge margin. And so the question is actually Melbourne Storm good at breeding good coaches or bad coaches in this case, which could obviously not be the case. But what's really going on? And I think a lot of it would be about expectations. A lot of it might be around the state of the clubs who are picking them up. A lot of it will be, in their minds, these guys, I suppose expectations again, but these guys are going to be very, very good at what they do. Therefore, they're going to come to us. Therefore, they're going to, do very, very well. And then they have some lack of patience for it. Guys who've been generally head coaches at other places, though, will be afforded a little bit more patience, I would say. So like a Wayne Bennett at the Dolphins or, Souths or whatever, it's like, well, the problem can't be him. The problem must be us. Whereas when they go and hire a kid, a young guy who's never coached anywhere else and it's not working, they'll very quickly jump to, this isn't working, then we're going to go get someone else.
Yes.
So if you give an average coach 3 years and he's able to build, he'll probably be able to find success. If you give an experienced coach 3 years, he'll do the same thing. And if you give a young guy 3 years, he'll probably do the same thing. But the problem is they never give those young guys 3 years.
It's an interesting stat, mate, that you're saying. So obviously there's some data in that that's on the whole, if you're coming from a great organization, coaches that come out of that as assistant coaches are generally not doing well elsewhere, as good as their stats would suggest from those good clubs. And the guys that are coming out of lower clubs are actually far outseeding results-wise when they leave and go elsewhere. Would you say, we've talked previously on an episode about this monopoly effect, where you're in those great clubs, there's a whole lot of stuff outside your control, such as, good budgets, good systems, good structures, which you don't sometimes even realize are massively influencing your coaching. And it's not till you go to somewhere else and you realize I don't have those things, that they become really key factors that you go, oh, the environment that you were in was actually magnifying your coaching effect.
Yeah, and you can imprint the same conversation on a player. I was doing so well here. I've left. I believed I could go to that next place and do great, and I haven't been able to. Like, that's the story I've heard hundreds of times as part of the research. In terms of yeah. So the other thing too is that when you've been part of a highly successful club, there's a whole bunch of normative behaviors that are established to that club because they're not in chaos. So a club in chaos is like a mix of the 5 different head coaches that have been there the last 5 years of all the different habits and systems they've had. And, your physio's just left and the S&C guy's gone, and, or someone's come in and changed something else again, and we've got a new CEO or whatever. So when you've been at that really successful club, there's all these great normative behaviors, and you're like, well, wherever I go, I'm going to imprint this. So I had this great conversation with Ryan Hoffman. I've probably mentioned this before. It's really hard having this conversation with you because I don't remember what I've said, this being the third in the trilogy. Accusing myself. Ryan Hoffman said he was at Melbourne Storm and he went to the Warriors, and he was like, and the Warriors are, there's a minimum number that you require in order to be a grand final winning team. And we'll call that 2.5, that number. It won't make much sense, but it needs years and years to get to 2.5. And the Warriors are the only club in the comp outside of the Dolphins that have never got to that number. Everyone else in the league has at some sort of time or enough been stable enough to win the comp. Doesn't mean you will win the comp, but to get that level of stability, and the Warriors have never had that level of stability. The closest they got there was 2.3 in the year they lost the grand final. I think it was 02, I might be wrong. Maybe 2010, I'll have to go back. Anyway. Even last year were like, oh, they're getting close. No, not quite. They just kind of chop and change a little bit more. But he was saying, I want to go to the Warriors and I want to turn the Warriors into the Storm. And I'm going to take the things that we did there and turn them into here. And he said, after like 6 months, oh, this is not working. I can't do this. I can't get these guys to do this in the way that I want to. And I had a chat with Razor at Los Angeles. He was talking about his time at Clipping. And he said it was the same thing, even as a player. And so I think sometimes those guys who've been assistants at really good systems think we're just going to take those methods and apply them. And the problem is that often creates a lot of change and chaos. And the problem is the Melbourne Storm have been doing these things, or the Penrith Guns have been doing these things now for years. And when you've been doing something for years, you can refine it, you adapt it, everyone understands it. And it's also, your juniors all learn that way. That's the first thing they ever learn. What you're asking is a bunch of 27-year-olds to tackle differently and to change to the new system that you've now brought in. And they can't learn and unlearn at the same time. And that causes chaos.
Well, I've got a little analogy that I think that sort of sums up a little bit that chaos. I just thinking of it then, mate. Like, you're talking about sporting environments, but say you take a family environment for this metaphor, and you talk about a chaotic family life versus a stable family life. Like a stable family life. Yeah.
This is my life with 4 kids, right? Yeah.
A stable family life is a mum, dad, and the kids, and it's the same mum and dad for 20 years. They have the same job, they live in the same area, it's the same friends, same schools. Your kids get used to a stable life, right? And it's easy and it's good. It's the systems, there's routines, they're ingrained. This is a chaotic family life where it's a single family, there's new partners coming in and out, and the kid has to adapt to the new spouse that comes in, that changes 6 monthly. You change house, you change location, country, job, and that's chaotic, right? And you like to think if that's equating to like a sports team, when a child from a chaotic environment goes to another chaotic environment once they're older and left it, they're probably more acclimatized to it, right? Like they kind of go, okay, yeah, this is kind of my family life was that, and they're going from chaotic to chaotic, and they're ready for it. Whereas if you're going from a very stable, organized family life, and then you're going to a chaotic one as a new team, or you get hit pretty hard. Like, oh, this, there's not two parents here. We don't have a consistent routine, and then it's a real shock to the system. What do you reckon about that analogy, mate? How does that fare?
So first of all, yes, chaos makes it extremely difficult. If you look at the educational outcomes for kids who are army brats, whose dads, particularly in the US, have changed bases like every 2 years, 100%. It's very, very difficult for those kids to do well in their education. I liken it to, when we move house, for the first 6 weeks, in order to get something, I have to move a box to move a box. And then for the next 6 weeks, I move one box. And by the third, 12th week, moving house, it doesn't happen quickly, right? By the 12th week, you go, okay, now I can go and start finding stuff and putting stuff away. But it's going to take a year before we start, or 6 months before we start putting up the pictures, or getting to the detail, or putting the knives and forks in the order we want, right?
Mm.
So in that, think about that from a player perspective, is like you join a place, and at the moment you're just in the big brushstrokes. What are the patterns we play? How do we do things here? Getting into the detail is where you actually start to get better as a player, right? And so or even as a coach, right? If you go, we've talked about this before, if you go coach barbarians, you're just going like, we're going to go one way, then the other, and like, you get to no detail whatsoever. It takes a long time to get to detail, right? The limited conversations that I know, Simon's probably had with Eddie Jones, probably talking about, like when he coached the Wallabies in that year, he never got to any level of detail. If he did, he was pulling his remaining hair out because he was never able to instigate any of that. Because it's like, hey, the feedback would be, hey, I know what you want to do and I understand this, but let's just understand the basic patterns first, right? Let's come back to simplicity before we go into complexity. I think part of the challenge is always continuously bouncing. Is those players themselves never get to detail, right? If you sat down with a Cameron Smith, who was at the Storm for a very long time, with the same guys for a very long time, or an Andrew Johns, the detail of which they can talk about the components of the play, not only with each other, but individually, are incredible, right? If people are all of a sudden, all the time at different places, there's some guys that have been at 10 clubs, they've bounced around all these different places. Maybe they never get to that point of detail, and maybe in some areas, but not others. So I think I don't know if I've answered your question specifically very well, but one thing too is that if you keep going to different places, and it's like, Ben, if you had a different girlfriend every week, you never get too attached, right? Whereas Mrs. Herring now, has the joy of seeing you in your new budgie strugglers, as you told me before, but also of getting to know you very well and getting levels of detail. And they would say, don't build a house in your first year of marriage. Do the simple stuff, get to the complexity later, get to the difficult stuff that you can cope with as you go. And as you build in your relationships, you become more capable of doing more complex things and being able to suffer the challenges that come with it. Whereas new relationships, none of that's really possible. I think I've given you this analogy before, is that when people move countries and they're suffering a language barrier, they generally can only do, quite simplistic jobs, drive a taxi, delivery and stuff like that. They provide a stable enough environment for their kids to be able to go to university and then go further. So we liken that to, if you create stability in the environment of a club, the next generation can then actually build on that. So if you stabilize a club, you don't get success other than in terms of the innate cohesion, but in terms of skill development, it comes after that. So it means you create a stable environment creates stability of systems, allows skill acquisition drives you to further success.
Well, in that regard, Len, are we picking, like, did teams pick the modern head coach? Are we picking on the wrong things a lot of the time? What else do you got to look for? Because if you're saying to me here that if you can't just pick on the success rate of where they've come from, because there's factors in that which are outside of the control, which aren't relevant here. What are some of the behaviours we're looking at for a coach outside of the wins?
We have data that we use which talks about whether a coach is a development coach or whether they're sort of like a delivery coach. And I think a lot of the time with a delivery coach, he will bring a lot of people with him.
What's a delivery coach?
Delivery coach is, we're going to win today. I don't care about 5 years time from now. The delivery coach is somebody who's there to have success straight away. And oftentimes it comes with the pressures from the board. We've got a new stadium. We've got some short-term revenue issues. We need to get crowds. We need to get exciting talent here. Obviously, the ramifications of that decision are not necessarily understood, but it's about win today. The fans are sick of rebuilds. The board's sick of rebuilds. And because rebuilds are often not done very well or done in an appropriate way or actually built to be sustainable at all, then you have this kind of roundabout of constant failure and people not understanding why the success is not coming. To be kind, Newcastle Knights have probably been through that now for 21 years or something. Continuous rebuilds and not to having any kind of delivery. And so a delivery coach is basically going to go, okay, he's going to do this for us now. And the board is generally willing to forego a lot of, they don't necessarily understand they're going to do it, but they're willing to forego future success for that success to come immediately. So we're willing to bring in players in terms of implementation of talent, understanding that we might lose quite a few kids in that process. So those delivery coaches will bring people with them for the last organization they've been in, or they'll bring in senior guys and they'll use all sorts of terms like, these senior guys are going to be really good for our young players. The ones who are remaining, there'll be a great influence on them. So therefore it's justifiable. And so a huge amount of challenges will then come with that in the fallout from those decisions. But one thing we understand with clubs is that the board and the coach, each decision they make will have fallout for up to 20 years. Right?
20 years?
Yeah. I'll give you an example. Richmond, I mean, if it takes in some comp, so in the AFL, takes minimum 5 years to put something together to be kind of a successful club. You're always building on something. So every game that every person has ever played at that club is going to affect how the next game is played. Right? So you go back to take every player you have. Some guys have been around for 10 years, but something's going to put you in that state. So, and I think in the early 80s, Richmond, had a lot of success. They had a year where their previously successful head coach who won grand finals had missed the finals, and they missed because they had some injuries to senior players, and their response was, we're a finals team if you don't make finals. So they sacked the head coach and they brought in their captain as the coach for the next year, and they were still well built. So they made the grand final the next year, but the players were not happy with that person's demeanor. And so some of the senior players left, and his response to that, well, is if you're going to leave, I'm going to acquire a whole bunch of players from the club that took them. So they lost guys and they gained guys. The next year they came last, and the board goes, okay, we're going to sack him. And then they went through 5 coaches over the next 7 years. They didn't recover. They didn't start to build again until 2013. So it was another 20 or so years. And then they worked towards winning grand final 8 of them. So that was 82, 84, something like that. We're in chaos for the next 20 years, started to rebuild, built towards 19, I think it was, won some grand finals. So these things go in long cycles. AFL is particularly long cycles because it's the most stable league in the world. Therefore, it takes longest to build clubs. But there's always ramifications. There's always things that have happened, even if it's simply affecting mindset of the fans who put more pressure on people, right? Like the Paul Waratahs have had 1 win in the last, since we got back to Super 10, since 95, 1 title win. And so the long-suffering fans are like, this is going to be the year. This is going to be the year. It's going to happen. And, they may or may not be structurally built to do that. It's very hard for them. It's not really fair on them in many ways. But that pressure, it's going to manifest itself in comments to the coach. Is this going to be the year? Is this going to be the year we're going to do it? Do you think we can overcome it?
Do you think fans actually have a big influence on?
Not only that, there's a gap between the fans and the players and the coaches, but even there's a gap between coaches and reality sometimes. We talked about that. That's the monopoly effect. I am the reason we're winning. Well, that may not be the case.
Yeah.
Everyone, including I, we are always a little bit off. We always have a bias. I think they did a study once and they found that actually football commentators are some of the worst people at picking outcomes because they have a bias towards certain things. They think they know more, therefore that bias kind of puts you in a certain direction. We know we're terrible, as much as something ABC the other day, at being able to predict the future, because we think the trends as they are now will continue as they are, but things are always moving and always changing. And so none of us are very, very good at predicting the future, and none of us are very good at understanding causality.
And winning doesn't help that, does it? If you're coming from a super successful place, sometimes that lends itself to thinking that that's replicatable everywhere.
100%. It's 90% in the setup. It's 90% the construct of the club that you are part of. And so, like, I experienced this literally myself at Suntory. I couldn't get that team to lose no matter how hard I tried. No matter how much I tried to stuff it up accidentally, I couldn't derail them. None of us as coaches could derail them.
Because Suntory, for context, is a hugely successful team with a lot of history that's always done well, has great setup, structure, budget, resources. It's phenomenal.
A whole bunch of guys who've been at Waseda University together. There's this group that have been together for a long time. Eddie left as a coach. Some of the coaches stayed. I came in as a coach. The next season, we did even better than when Eddie was there. We went undefeated through the entire season, no matter what I did. But we could not stop their success. There is so many examples of a new coach taking over, and that team keeps winning or wins more than they did the year before because they're actually even better set up. One of the great things I liked was Leicester City when Ranieri came in, because of the way in which he came into the club. He only had 8 days before the season started. So he could not make changes to the club, and then away they went. And other clubs, the numbers were fantastic, but they had a lot of change themselves. And so Leicester City kind of walked through a window a little bit. And it was fantastic statistically. Yeah, so sometimes the circumstances will mean you can't make change, and either that's built in structurally or it happens through some sort of strange set of accidents. That helps. Like, there's a club in the UK, Reading, whose Chinese owner came in, spent hundreds of millions of dollars on bringing in new players. There was a disaster. They went down a division. The FA actually halted all trading of players, and they started winning more games. So it's just about, they just stopped them trading. That was great. That helped. We can see it particularly around the size of clubs. The size of clubs is the fan base, right? If you look at, in the AFL, Carlton and Richmond are huge clubs being very unsuccessful. And one comment I make quite regularly is Carlton's problem is not a person. The Carlton's problem has been Carlton, right? Carlton's problem is being the big boss, that you have to have success, or previously being the big boss in the comp. Or, you could say this with the Auckland Blues in New Zealand, right? The pressure's always there to win because we've got 1 million people wanting this club to do well. Or the Warriors, for that example. There's a couple of million people wanting the Warriors to be successful now, and we're so big we can't fail, but you can. That's the problem. Being big is, whereas, when you're a new club like the Brumbies were at the early stages, there wasn't really a lot of pressure, and you could build over years. And if you had a bad season like we did in 98, it's like, okay, we just move on, right? Eddie Jones wasn't fired at the end of 98. 99, they came 5th. 2000, 2nd. 2001, when I single-handedly won the grand final, that's probably more Andrew Walker. We beat the Sharks in the final. So that the size definitely counts.
Right. And mate, what sort of things do we need to talk about when we're looking at coaches?
Okay, so we sort of went to the delivery coach, and then there's a building coach, right? But there's also the guy who, if you give enough time, like an Ange Postecoglou, will build something, right? So Ange generally comes in and changes the list. That was doubled up for him his time at Tottenham, with also a large amount of injuries. But he wanted to put something together. He also dramatically changes how the team plays. I mean, could be talking about rugby or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? But changes how the team plays. So that's going to require some underperformance in the short term. And then he wants to probably bring in guys who he thinks can play his way, but then he'll develop it later. Right? So there's all sorts of different guys with different views of how to go about doing this. Then there's the guys who are just like pure development. And sometimes just pure development is suicide. We saw, examples where if you don't necessarily understand cohesion in the right way, you'll go, well, I'm going to take a bunch of kids now and bring those kids in, and then you've got no shared experience, and you don't have the right systems in place underneath you. You have no shared experience, you have no experience, and you get annihilated. You saw that with the Brisbane Broncos a couple of years ago. You see that a lot happen in football. It's you, everything you have to do actually needs to happen probably more slowly. I think probably Sir Alex Ferguson, when he got to Man U, probably one of the best people at ever doing that, is he stabilised the team, then he started to bring kids through, right? But he set systems up in place. If you can't educate people to play the way you want, right, and you don't have those systems in place, then there is no point having an academy.
Ooh. Is it, yeah. So if you're trying to create an academy with no foundation, no base, you think you need to have one. So you just have one and there's no structure, no pathway on it.
Yeah, and we were
time.
talking to a football club that's now in the Premier League, and they were saying we'd used one academy player in like 23 years. None of them are ever good enough, right? So we get them, we buy players from other places. So it's almost like there's like a tokenistic notion to it, or we're there because it makes people happy. But if you need to be bringing people through, you need to get to the players young, you need to put great coaches into that system. The academy needs to be playing the same way that the senior team is. Like, this is one of the problems with Welsh rugby, is because like none of the provinces are attached to whatsoever to the teams. None of the provinces in the tier 3 are attached to the provinces in the tier 2. Right? Whereas Canterbury or Tasman are pretty much playing the way the Crusaders play. You have these 21s program. So all of this, you have to build systems to educate people in the way you want to do things, and you have to have continuity of that. And you can't tie that to a person. If it ties to a coach, you have 5 different coaches in 5 years. You have 5 different ways of playing in 5 years. And so the academy coach will sit down and goes, right, okay, we're changing again, are we? Like, how can you build to that? I remember someone talking to me about, his time at the Crusaders junior system. It's like, it's pretty simple, but God, it's always consistent.
Yeah.
And so simplistically doing things the right way, you can get to the detail when they get to the senior team, but you want them to arrive knowing exactly what you need to do. It was really interesting hearing about Jordan Mailata when he went to the NFL. The guys who tried to go across older, it's too hard for them. It's too much to unlearn, like a Jared Hayne. But the coach of the Philadelphia Eagles on the offensive line was saying, I just loved him so much because I didn't have to fix any of the crap that he'd learned in college.
Yeah.
And it took a bit longer, but he was like the blank canvas. I'm like, oh, yeah, there we go again. So, because he was young, they could put the time into him. Whereas for Jared, it was too late. It was like, we can't do this in 6 weeks, right? So they gave Jordan a couple of years, and now I think he's captain of the offensive line. He's won a Super Bowl, right? And you look at that kid who came across, Mason Cox, came across from basketball. If they come across young, you can teach them, right? There's really interesting cases about learning versus unlearning. And it's like the less they have to unlearn, the easier it is. And it's not even so much about age sometimes, it's just about like what they've done. But yeah, building an education system as to how we play and to be able to institute that is really important. So you can then, when they come to you, it's going to bear fruits, right? Not only do they have shared experience, but they also have institutional knowledge. But you've got to stop changing the institutional knowledge, right? I remember going to Suntory and say, okay, well, I'm going to use the line-out system I used at the Western Force. And I nearly destroyed the team. I should have just stuck with what they had, but I didn't understand it, and I thought mine was better, which was stupid. But even if it was better, it doesn't matter because it took so long to adapt to that system that we nearly, I think in one of the finals, we won one of like 12 lineouts or something. We almost stuffed it up, right? Because it came under pressure and just completely fell apart.
When you review that sort of thing yourself, like, and let's talk a little bit bigger about a bigger scale review of how you went. When boards and things are reviewing a coach's performance, say they're not happy, you talked earlier about there's a little bit of perhaps disgruntlement and there's a little bit of bias in their thinking around that coach. What sort of stuff should a review consist of? What's in a review? What should you be looking at? And what are actually the factors that kind of you should just be unbiased towards when you're doing that?
I think, like, obviously, there's the only company in the world that can do a good review, and everyone else is terrible at it, right? But what I would say is, like, whenever you're looking at performance, the first thing you need to think about is, what are we up against? Okay, what is the context of what we exist in, the competition? So, here's an example in the NRL. to win the NRL in 1999 or 2000 was easier than it is now. It's much harder now. The reason for that is because between 1995 and 2002, I want to get this right, there was 23 different changes to teams. Teams either merged, demerged, ended, started. So the whole league was in chaos. And even for the clubs that had not changed, they were suffering huge levels of change because the new clubs that kept being started up were eating the old clubs. We saw this particularly in netball in Australia. They had a five teams in Australia and 5 teams in New Zealand. They ended that comp. They started 3 new teams in Australia, and the 3 new teams went and ate all of the 5 old teams. So everyone was unstable. So therefore, in an unstable environment, it's easier just to win through talent because there isn't any cohesion. If you're in the AFL, you absolutely have to look at it in context of, okay, how are we built, how are we put together, how does that compare to everyone else? How are they constructed? The other thing too is to understand the best team doesn't always win the comp. In fact, most of the time it doesn't, I'd say. Maybe 50%.
How do you define the best team?
The best team, so if you have a great year and you come 6th, and let's say your league means that all the finals are held in your hometown, happens with the AFL sometimes, or your home state. And let's say you're Richmond and Geelong have to come to Melbourne to play a home game, but you're actually 2 minutes down the road. We know that crowds affect performance, they affect the referees. You don't have to be better to beat them. You just have to be close to them to beat them. You win that game, you play West Coast Eagles in the grand final, who have to be 20% better than you because the grand final is always held in Melbourne. Richmond win the comp, but they're the 3rd best team in that scenario. They didn't do anything right or wrong. Or you have injuries. We saw in this year's NRL grand final, the Storm team was so much better set up than the Broncos, and they lost one of their centers, and the numbers just went bang. Right? And then you saw Broncos come back into the game, win the game. So we've talked about color of jersey can affect performance. Sometimes, if you
color of jersey, what's the stat on that one?
So we found that teams were underperforming on attack by 40% if you can't change the color of the jersey for the first time.
40% difference if you wore your away strip.
Have we talked about this?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so there were these games that weren't making sense to us in terms of like a highly cohesive team was losing to a low cohesion team. I'll offer you an example. 2007 New Zealand All Blacks against France in the quarterfinal.
Yes.
Right? And we were like, oh, that's really interesting. And we couldn't figure out why these teams weren't winning because their numbers were good. Sometimes injury, sometimes cards. But one of the things we noticed, and I experienced it myself, was like my club for its centenary changed its jersey. And I'm like, this doesn't feel right. And so we found that these teams were, their offload was dropping away. They weren't passing accurately. And so they were scoring less points. Defense was staying the same, but they weren't passing accurately. And so I asked people who were allowed to pass the ball, like Sterling Mortlock and Danny Gutierrez, and they said, yeah, what happens is you turn and you're looking for a colour and you flinch because you just like that. So bang. Because you look at the opposition, it's like, that's a different colour. Whereas you turn to look at the colour. And like, there's these great footage we use, like one of guys in football whose team is the same as the on the sideline. So they pass it to the steward on the sideline. I'm going to get this wrong. There was a game, Broncos Storm, where one of the Storm players who used to play the Broncos passed it to a Broncos player because he was calling for it. And he looked, he went, yes, he went, just passed it and scored up the other end. Xavier Coates, as it was. Anyway, so, but yeah, so we just found that there was like all of these games, and even in the EPL and football, I think guys, teams this year in the EPL, I think on average you score up 2.2 goals per game, something like that. And, I don't want to get the number wrong, so I'll just say it's about that. But teams, I think, are scoring 1.2 goals per game at the moment in the EPL when they're wearing a new jersey for the first time. I think Crystal Palace lost to Beaconsfield the other day in the FA Cup because they were in this yellow jersey they never won before, at least in a year or so. So just this, so things like that can affect performance, right? And I love the fact and so what was happening was, on average, a team will win 21-19. The home team will win 21-19 in a game of rugby in a rugby league, give or take. And they were only scoring 14 points, but they're still only allowing 19 points. If you look at the All Blacks with white jerseys, they're not quite the same.
Not quite the same, no.
Yeah. And so South Africa against Ireland last World Cup, all that weird stripy thing. Like it does happen if you have really like the good teams. They'll change the jersey color and they'll come up against Namibia. They'll still win. But, I think it's definitely the last World Cup because of this color blindness issue. The data was about the same. It's not changing. It's not always changing the outcome. Sometimes just changing how many points you score. When we won against Georgia when they wore that black jersey in 11, I don't remember that. They really did not score a lot of points. So it just seems that, and people just go, oh, something's off, but they don't quite know it. Or a lot of people say, oh, jerseys, jersey change all this stuff. But it always seems to be the first time. And if you get used to it, I know the Rebels, in the conversation with them, they use their training jersey as their starting jersey, which might help. Yeah, it's get used to it. So the answer is there's lots of different things that can affect performance.
Yes.
And, sometimes you'll just have a really bad day, and the reaction to that, I think you saw this at like Crows, the AFL, maybe not talking too much about AFL, but like they did a review based off losing a grand final and, really wanted to change a whole bunch of different things culturally and ended up going and doing that camp where players basically felt like they were being assaulted. Like it went really, you can look it up in the paper, but it went really, really pear-shaped off the back of that. And one of the players just said, guys, we just had a bad day. Stop worrying about it. Like we had a bad day in the grand final. Let's just move on. Let's not try to fix this through there's something wrong with us. So I think the really good clubs just understand we're going to lose games, we're going to win games. There's good luck and bad luck. We just move through it. The bad ones are this kind of we have to do a review. We have to fix this. We have to make changes. This is action bias. We have to take action. We have to look like we're doing something here. Whereas sometimes just doing nothing is fantastically successful. I might be wrong about this. I think there was a study that looked at investing, that looked at people who were investing, and they're looking at this online platform people were using to invest. And the people who were the most successful at it were people who died, right?
Because they didn't touch anything.
They didn't touch anything, or the people who lost their login.
Well, as another analogy.
I love data like that.
Right. I think that's good. Another analogy, going back to that family one, is when you're going through as a parent, sort of those tricky years around puberty and teenagehood and all that stuff, if you try to react to everything that happens, you're going to be chasing your tail because some of the stuff that happens is just, a biological sort of blowout that your son or daughter has. And It's just what it is. And the more you dive into trying to get to the bottom of it and what it means and the reaction to it, you've just wasted a whole lot of time because it's just puberty. And sometimes they blow out because they're going through the stage of life. And if you just go, okay, it's just puberty, this is what they're going through. Sure enough, in a few months' time, 6 months, whatever, a year's time, it wasn't even an issue. And it's something you laugh about because, this is the way I behaved. And you only have to think back to yourself and you think, geez, I did some funny things when I was going through that stage. But I'm glad mum and dad didn't do anything. They just let me roll and work through that stuff and it was no issue. Had they have said, this is no good, you're off to military camp to discipline for this behavior because X, Y, and Z, you'd be a different sort of person, wouldn't you? That would be the bit which affects you and probably in a negative way.
Yes. Yeah. And the chaos that causes. So there's a turn of phrase called pound the rock. Have you heard that before?
No.
Okay. So it's used by the San Antonio Spurs, but used by Brisbane Lions. It's kind of known. It's a parable. I'm going to get this. So there's a guy called Jacob Rees, who was a social reformer. And I think what he was trying to do is change people's rights to vote. And I think he did it through like mailing people, but he knew he had to do millions and millions of drop-offs in order to do this. Right? But what it basically said was, he said, if you're a stonemason and you want to break a rock in half, the only way to do it is you have to hit the same spot 1,000 times. But you see no change in the first 999, but on the 1,000th, it splits in half. So if you keep changing the angle, the thing's just never going to change. But the only reason it breaks is because of the 999 times you've done it prior. So all of those hits contribute towards something, but sometimes you will not see a change. So there's so many things you can adjust to that. And one of the biggest things I'm really interested in is terms of phrase. Kind of like might be the next topic we go to in a second. But
hit me with these terms of phrases.
So one of them is if you keep if you keep, what is it? People attributed to Einstein, which is the meaning of insanity. The meaning of insanity is keep doing the same thing, expecting different results, right? It's also called practice. Okay. And also it's important to understand Einstein never actually said it, but people attributed to Einstein. But I want to get to the other one in a second. But the point we were talking about, and which I've sort of never finished, I'm terrible at this, I apologize, is you asking me about what sort of things do we need to think about? Okay. So the first thing is the context of what we're in, right? The context of of what we're up against. The next part is how long is that competition? Like when are we expecting success? So in the NBA, what does you have, like 82 games or something? Or, the MLB, you got 160 games. So there's a context there of we have time to put together a team from scratch that can win this thing, and we're going to improve as we go. If you're in a World Cup, it's too late for all that, right? So therefore, how you put together a team, together for a World Cup. I don't think that Gatland didn't know who to pick for Wales, so he just picked the Ospreys team and he won the Six Nations. Like, that's a way to do it, right? But England can't do that. So there's a whole bunch of ways and means in which you can have success, but in terms of the when, like the when is almost the most important question to ask the board. When do we want to win? When do we want to have success? When are you going to lose patience? Because that can drive everything else, okay? If I said to you, Ben, I need you to put on 20 kilos in 3 weeks, right? That's different to 6 months. 6 months means you could go to the gym, you could build it through muscle. 3 weeks is I'm going to have to drink donuts. So all these different components of the when is going to affect how you go about doing it. The when is going to make you think, okay, I need to import talent, or I need to import already built teams, or if the board said to you, God forbid, we're not even interested in winning in the next 5 years. There's no relegation here. That's the thing I always gets me. There's no relegation. Take your time, right? How do we do this? How do we do this? How do we build ourselves to be unbeatable in 10 years' time? That's a great question to ask, right? Like that's the dream question, because then you've got permission to lose to a certain extent. And one thing I do see quite a lot of is boards going, yes, we want to rebuild, but when the losses start to come, and maybe they've gone a little bit too hard on the kids scenario, or a little bit too hard on gutting the place, it's like sometimes you need to warn them they're going to get embarrassed by losses, but sometimes they're not ready for that embarrassment. Oh yeah, no problems. But if they've always won 9 games a season, they're not sure what 2 feels like. And so 2 feels a lot worse than they think it's going to, and they're going to be bullied by their mates in the bar and stuff, and their particularly the board members. And then people are going to start calling them, say, this guy's shit. This becomes a yes but conversation. Yes, he's a good coach, but we just didn't think the players are getting us down. Well, they're losing every game. What do you think's going to happen? So, the context, the when, the how do I want to play as a coach? With the players I have, can they play the way I want? If I can't, how long is it going to take to get some change? How long have they been doing that other way? If I'm then going to try to get change out of them, or if I don't think I can get change out of them, I'm going to have to import that talent. What's the fallout going to be from the importation of that talent? Right? Who am I going to lose? No one ever asks who am I going to lose. We talk about sign 1, lose 3. You sign a player, the next guy coming through gets frustrated, he goes, and the next, much younger kid who's kind of like the dream was following that player, he's like, well, if they're going to do this, I'm going to go, right?
Yeah.
And then that guy who you brought in, he goes because he's only been there for 2 years, and then there's like, where are the kids? And the kids haven't come through, and so you have to buy again. Right? So that's how these things have these kind of consistent ramifications. And another question on the when, for example, is like, board tenure is really important.
I remember you talking about this, like if you're only on a short-term board, it's short-term thinking, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that all of those components haven't even gotten to you sort of onto the field yet. These are all just basically sort of general, bigger picture. In terms of the context, the other thing with context too is when you do get onto the field, like what are teams, not only what are we up against, but what are teams putting against us? So the Sunwolves never faced a really good team at any point. People always putting their B team against them, so we never really knew how bad they could be. A good example is putting a bad team against is the Waratahs made 6 changes, and I think the Crusaders put 90 on them, or 96. I might have that number wrong. Remember that?
I remember that game.
Yeah, I was at the Brumbies. We enjoyed that. And the Paul Waratahs, we played the next week, put 50 on them because like they had to change back again. It just completely threw their season off. It was for all the right reasons, right? And sometimes you can do it. I think the Bulls did it against the Stormers in a preliminary final, and then won the final the next week or won the semi-final. But like it just the making those changes and understanding that things can go kind of completely wrong, and then what the response is to that. The response that so many clubs have is so negative and such big a change. It's not necessarily needed. And I think that a lot of the things we learn in life, I actually find with board members, even if they've played sport, they don't necessarily apply to their time at being on a board, which is, this is going to require some patience. It's almost like they become as reactive because when you're a board member, you're not really judged anywhere near as much as you are at sport. You might have a shareholder meeting once a year, but a rugby game or a football game is like having a shareholder meeting in front of a crowd that's throwing stuff at you, screaming at you every week. And so when there is reaction, we react ourselves. We think that reaction requires further reaction. What actually requires is patience.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So we don't do that. We kind of just go, no, we've got to do something here. We've got to do something here to fix it.
Yeah, mate.
I've got a question. I've got a question for you.
Hit me.
So one of the things is culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yes, I've heard the phrase.
Yeah. Okay. Do we know who said it?
That would be someone like, is it Drucker?
Yes. Okay. It's been repeated to me oftentimes. I remember having a meeting with a guy at the Big Four accountants, and he's like, "I understand what you're saying, but doesn't culture eat strategy for breakfast?" And I go, "Yeah, okay, well, maybe it does." But oftentimes, one of the things we talk about is what's the driver of culture, like what are the things that drive it. So turnover will change your culture, or a small environment will make communication more easy, things like that. But anyway, so I actually was interested in this, and I actually went and looked at that statement, and so someone sent me this document that actually had a cohesion strategy for breakfast, and it's from the Drucker Institute. So I contacted the Drucker Institute, and I contacted the guy because there's actually a group of people that actually think Drucker never said it. What he did say was culture is very hard to shift, behaviors are hard to move. So I contacted the guy and I said, "Do you know that Drucker never said this?" And he goes, "Oh, I just Googled it. I didn't actually research it." This guy's a university professor.
Yep.
So I ended up on this email chain of about 20 different professors at this university. And at one point, this guy steps in, he goes, "Sorry guys, he never said it. He said this." And that was it. So Drucker never said culture strategy for breakfast. But yet it's something we talk about all the time, right? I'm not saying it's not important. It's just on that part, he never actually said that statement. But that doesn't mean it isn't true. Okay? But here's my question for you is, how do we know it is?
Well, yeah, it's a little bit more subjective. Even that statement is just a subjective throw it out there thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You don't know. Well, this is just before we get to that one, I think it's important that some of these rules and statements that get thrown out like that, you just have that little bit of time to actually critique it. There's another rule which just along this methodology of thinking around, there's one, the 58-38-7 rule, which I've been in conferences where they've talked about body language, and they talk about it like, I've been in clinics where I said, where someone stands up and goes, "What do you think is the most important when you're speaking? Is it your body language, your tone, or the words?" Like, without question, for me, it's the actual words, but they always come back on those things as, according to the science, it's 55% of when you're speaking, the most important thing is your body language, then 38% your tone of voice, and 7% the actual words. And I've always gone, that's rubbish. If you're up there speaking and you think it's not the words, if you think your body language is more important than the words, then no. And so I went back and looked at the research on which that came from. And the research was based on just doing one word and the word like maybe, and like whether you did this with it.
Yeah.
And then the whole, people now quote that as if that is the most important thing when you're getting up on stage is the body language, according to the stat.
It's
not the words.
I could not agree more with you. And someone who's spoken now hundreds of times, right? And we're always bringing new stuff to the presentations. I try to change it every couple of weeks or at least every couple of months, right? And whenever I get to a slide that's new, I change my demeanor because I'm not sure, right? So if I've done a slide 700 times, there's one we use, I can explain this to you in 3 minutes. I'm feeling confident now even thinking about it. But then when I'm thinking about the slide I tried the other day about Edinburgh trams or whatever it might be, I'm like, what am I supposed to do here? Okay, up is down. And so like I change. So your physical, your body will represent how you feel. Okay. You see that on the field. If guys, they say, guys don't have any pride in the jersey. Well, it's because they're not sure on the play you're trying to run because they've only done it twice and with 3 different people. They're not sure about the person next to them. So they're not going to be looking proud because ambiguity, there's a great quote that Chesterton talks about, a psychologist talks about clarity is confidence. Clarity is confidence. If I'm sure, I know, you can see it. And one of the grand finals for Adelaide, and they lost this grand final, and during the national anthem, they were doing the power stance. So power stance is you have your legs a little bit wider, and that represents somebody who's confident. But their idea is like, well, if I just show I'm confident, then I'll be confident. It doesn't work that way. And it's like they were nervously standing there with their legs really wide apart to do the power stance, and then lost by like 50, right? The guy I was talking to who was involved in that game said to the players before the game, to the opposition, guys, if they have to do that, they have massive problems. Like if they got to do stuff like that, that's a very different scenario, right? So I think that, 100%. So these things become law, but it's really important to get to the heart of that causality. What caused you to feel confident? I feel very clear about what I'm doing. Therefore, I'm going to physically show that. That is going to be physically represented because there's a very small level of differentiation between the words. Some people are good speakers, some people are great speakers, but you will physically manifest. I don't like that word, but your body will represent how you feel, right? And so maybe there is no causality in that, but there is correlation. There's statistical correlation. We've talked previously about the hugging study, the NBA, where people were finding that people who are hugging each other were winning more often, therefore they tried to get people to hug each other more often. What was actually happening is the teams have been together for a long time, hugged each other because they knew each other.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've kind of like done in this work is found we got stuff really, really wrong. Okay. So we started off with this number called TWI, which was basically like, what is a representation of the philosophy of the club, buy or build. Okay. Now, the most cohesive team we've ever found in football, in soccer, is a Real Madrid team that won the Champions League. I don't want to get the year wrong or get it wrong, but because we have every single game in football for the last 30 years, same in rugby union. And the best built team was Real Madrid. Now, Real Madrid's got a nickname is Galacticos. They don't develop, they buy. But they were able to buy and hold that talent together to build a very, very well-built cohesive team. Okay. Sometimes if you're a continuous development club, you end up with just kids all the time. You've got to be able to balance it off with keeping talent together. So every time we've gone, okay, so just because you're a development club doesn't mean you'll win. And just because you do develop doesn't mean you'll do well. Or just because teams do well doesn't mean they are development. So then we started looking at, let's just go look at the 9-10 combination as an example. Let's look at that first. So let's look at, if you do acquire players, where do they come from? How long are they together? And so we've started to temper what we're doing and say, okay, what is the actual truth of performance? And then that's for me sort of become the motto, like what's the truth of performance? No matter what it is, what do we actually know? What can we focus on? And if it is, you can win and hate each other, then that's the deal, right? Or if you can win can you win without a coach? Harlequins did it a couple of years ago. That doesn't mean coaches aren't important, but it can happen. Therefore, what was it about that made that team successful? I think it was probably the players were empowered to do stuff themselves. Okay, so therefore that can be possible. How much as coaches can we give to other people? So I think it's really, the thing for me is what I'm trying to focus on now is not I'm right, but how do we understand as best we can what actually is important? Okay. And so what I always begin with is, if somebody says something, can we prove it And even if you can't, that doesn't mean it isn't right? Like culture is really important. Absolutely. It's the normative behaviors of everybody. But what do we actually know about that statement is true? And how can we learn from it? And what can we prove? And how can we use that?
If you just come back to that statement that started this conversation, culture eats strategy for breakfast, I think whilst it sounds like it's a nice catchy little phrase, when you actually stop and think about your strategy, if that's your breakfast, that's equally as important as eating it. Like if you don't have it, you go hungry, right? Like if you actually break
I
it
think
down.
the easiest way to describe it is, and Nick Sturzaker, who works with us, is, you know, I am what I would call a hardline cohesion, like hardline radical, sort of like cohesion is everything. And he's like, you can't be that way. You can't be that way. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And then we talked about like how I'm wrong. And he's like, okay, maybe it's circular. Okay. If you have a great culture, your people will stay. If they stay, you'll build cohesion. If you build cohesion, you will win, but you also develop normative behaviors, which means you have a stronger culture. Right? That makes more sense.
Mm. Mm.
If you can keep teams together using other means, right, that may also create cohesion, which also means you could be successful. But if you have a great culture and you don't have cohesion, then it's a bunch of really nice people who don't know each other. But also too is it's very hard to have a good culture without stability, because without stability, you can't develop normative behaviors. There's a bunch of people thrown together. So, but Nick would even say to me, well, Ben, if you treated me terribly, I would leave. Right. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. Right. So therefore, my behavior is important. Okay. So I think that it's really, really none of these things sit on their own. Everything in an organization is connected to each other. And as they're connected, then we can start to build a real understanding about what their impact is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, mate. I reckon it's that everything feeds on itself. Like if you don't have one thing, it's going to affect the next thing.
Yes. But what is two? Culture doesn't eat strategy for breakfast, but strategy doesn't eat culture for breakfast. So now I'm going to get my metaphors wrong, but they will affect each other. And you can develop strategies to improve your cohesion. You can develop strategies to improve your culture, but also too is an easy example I always give. If you live in a small town, you'll behave a certain way. You live in a big town, you'll behave a certain way. That's just geography affecting it. Now, being in a small town or a big town is a strategy. So what are the strategies we can develop to make our culture better, or that will drive our culture? Or how do you pay people is really important. The KPIs you set for people is really important. That will also affect your culture. If you said to your players, we're not going to pay you anything, but we're going to pay you $1,000 every time you score a try, watch what happens on the field, right?
There's no passing, mate. There's tucking, there's
no
dummy and go.
No matter how good those guys are, if they're really, really great people, they will tend to do certain things in certain situations because their wife needs more money because they just had a kid, right? Like all those sort of things. That's not about good people. Just these certain situations will create poor behaviors. One of the studies I've actually gone and done is like terrible people who've done amazing things. Like Hitler banned smoking, for example. Just because he's an awful person doesn't mean he wasn't sensible in some areas, right? So, I think one of the biggest problems that we do tend to have is people are either good or bad. So we all right.
And that comes back to the start of this conversation, mate, when we're talking about why teams get rid of coaches, isn't it? It's that they're not good or bad, but that's the perception sometimes that the wider public have on coaches. They're good or bad.
And it's funny because I think probably one of the coaches that people are the most struggle with is Gatlin, because he's had such huge success in some places and such huge theoretical failure in other places, like when he came back to the Chiefs or recently with Wales. When we look at the data, we don't actually see any of that. We actually see him just performing exactly as he should, or very close to how he should.
With the squad and the cohesion of the squads that he's dealing with.
Yeah. When it's been good, he's been great. When it's been bad, it hasn't been great. And particularly if he comes into a system and tries to change something. So when he came back to the Chiefs, probably tried to introduce a couple of systems. Team would have been underperforming because they're trying to adjust to that system change. So cohesion is not just interpersonal understanding. It's also system understanding. So I think there's so much a narrative around coaches. Wayne Bennett's gone from being super coach to dinosaur like 5 times, right? What's the truth of it? He's a pretty good coach, over time. Like, it's going to be interesting to see the narrative. Let's put aside the good and the bad of it. You really see the narrative on Razor now, right? I think we keep comfortable to say that. Like, people are now going, okay, well, because then people will start to reflect on some of the Crusaders, right? And at Canterbury, and now the All Blacks. And so there is this, and this is the problem too with the boards, is like there are times when a coach is just like really hot, and there was a time when Checker had to be the guy we brought back. There was a time when it was Ewan McKenzie. There was a time when it was Eddie Jones. There was a time when it was Eddie Jones again. That they had to be the person. But people generally can't fix systems. And so we see this all the time. They just fall in love with this person. They are going to be, and then at the same time, like, Fagan, who's the coach of the Brisbane Lions, no one saw him being the next guy to win 2 grand finals in a row. It's the oldest coach in the league. Brisbane did that. The numbers started to come good. I will add that. But it wouldn't have made any sense to Woody if you'd said that guy who's the assistant coach has become a hugely successful coach. So
yeah,
it's such a guessing game. But what really frustrates me is all of a sudden guys become poisoned, become too good in people's eyes, and other guys become poisoned in people's eyes.
And that shifts, doesn't it? That public sentiment just moves.
It's shifting in 48 hours. It's just shifted the last 48 hours with Razor. Don't you think? Like, people weren't thinking it was too bad how they went towards the back end of last year. Now the sentiment, it will change. And I've seen that sentiment change around Gainline. I saw it change in 24 hours when they beat Australia in the World Cup, and everyone's like, "Oh, Gainline is a genius." It's like, no, Australia just had never played 10-12 together. To be a little bit biased on that, but like, because they weren't really, they weren't able to go further in that World Cup. They just annihilated Australia on that day. And I think one of the problems with our research, not with our research, I think one of the problems with cohesion is small amounts of change can actually create dramatic amounts of change. So 1 or 2 changes to a team and it can drop by like 40% if those changes are the wrong place. So people go, hang on, they've only changed 2 or 3 players. I remember Liverpool talking to this, they changed 1 midfielder. It was like the whole system kind of derailed with Liverpool this year, this early start of the year, and what it was doing in terms of how it was affecting Salah and his ability to play because he wasn't playing with the same guy anymore. And so the narrative will change based on a small amount, and all of a sudden this player is terrible, or this coach is terrible, or this club is terrible. And it's not necessarily understood in the right way. And so that's one thing we're trying to provide some context on, which is, like Brazil, Germany, 14, they lost 1 guy off the back of that. Brazil made 5 changes. Germany beat them 7-1. And all of a sudden that's a disaster. It was like, just don't change your back 5. They changed too much for that. Position changes, and it was disastrous. None of those players are bad players or a bad coach.
Benny, I've got one more question for you for this awesome session, mate. You've discussed about how just because you've got a good win-loss record as a coach, it doesn't always translate if you move away and try to coach a different team. Those data, those spreadsheets on win-losses aren't always the big driver of whether you're going to be successful. But what is important, mate? What is the data collection point and spreadsheets that we need to be looking at as coaches going forward in defining what a successful coach and team looks like?
There's this notion of, data is amazing, but data can send you off in really, really weird directions that don't have a hard-end causality, which is really, really important. And I think that if we do that, if you are focusing on the spreadsheets, then you're focusing on what you can measure. And we are not really anywhere near yet understanding what we can measure. So your focus has to be off the spreadsheets and finding what we can put onto them. Does that make sense? We need to focus not on what's already there, not on the data we have, but what is the data we don't have that best represents our experience of playing, because we don't really understand that yet. We don't really understand coaching.
What are we looking at the moment on the
Well,
data
so
spreadsheet?
what we are looking at, what we're focusing on is how well do players understand each other? That's not on a page right now. We're trying to put that on a page. How can a coach affect, I don't know, the level of understanding that players have? That's not yet on a piece of paper. How much has a player used this particular system of doing something before? That's not on a piece of paper. So what I'm saying is anything we've already collected, anything that is on the page right now is not necessarily working particularly spectacularly well in terms of trying to get to the heart of how we make things better. Let's try to look off the page. What are the things we don't know yet? What are things we haven't measured yet? Let's try to understand those as best we can.
And I love what you do. What an absolute pleasure to have you on the Coaching Culture podcast, brother.
I really enjoyed time with you, Ben.